The wind on the Karakoram Ridge had teeth. It sliced through Major Sorrel Tavelvanez's jacket and gnawed at her bones, the kind of cold that wasn't satisfied until it reached your marrow. She knelt in a pocket of snow-swept rock. Her M777 howitzer crouched beside her under a crude net of camouflaged netting and scrub branches. The sun had only just cleared the jagged peaks, spilling a harsh, amber light across the mountains and casting shadows long enough to hide a battalion. The air was so thin it made each breath a measured task, every exhale a puff of frost. From here, she could see everything: miles of mountains, the winding gray scar of the valley floor, and the single bridge that spanned the gorge like a fragile stitch in the earth. Perfect sight line, perfect position, perfect for doing absolutely nothing. Her orders had been explicit: observe, report, do not engage. The emphasis on that last part hadn't been accidental. She adjusted the high-powered binoculars pressed to her eyes, noting the bridge's skeletal steel trusses 500 meters below and almost 40 kilometers away. Her gloved hands moved automatically to the small leather-bound journal on her knee, where she jotted wind direction, barometric pressure, and topographic notes in neat columns. The calculations in the margins would look like gibberish to most officers, but to her they told story. The way air curled through a canyon, the exact moment a gust would lift or crush a shell's trajectory. Her earpiece crackled. Tavelvanez, status report. She keyed the mic, observer position established. Clear sight line to target. Current wind variables logged and compensated for. Her voice was clipped neutral. Colonel Harrow's voice came back, taut with the usual impatience. Remember your assignment, Major. Observation only. No firing. We'll handle the engagement from the primary team. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone iron flat. What she didn't say was that the primary team, the real team, was 30 clicks closer to the bridge, armed with the latest fire control computers and staffed entirely by officers who'd made their careers by stepping over people like her. Her position was a token gesture, a way to keep the legendary Tavelvanez name visible but not in the way, a safe place to sideline her out here in the cold, with nothing but a howitzer she wasn't supposed to use. She set the binoculars aside and brushed a strand of wind-tossed hair from her cheek. She'd been here before, not this ridge, but this role, the symbolic posting, the observer duty, the quiet exile disguised as strategy. Memory came unbidden. Fort Sill years ago, 20 recruits in firing formation, instructors pacing behind them like predators. She'd hit every target that day, targets the others had barely scratched. The murmurs had followed. Lucky shot fluke trying to be like her father. By evening, the whispers had calcified into something harder. Her successes were never her own. They belonged to the ghost of General Malcolm Tavelvanez, artillery savant and architect of half the doctrines still used today. She pressed her lips together and went back to work. The M777 crouched. Beside her wasn't one of the shiny new digital models. It was an older gun, stripped of its best tech. Even its base plate showed the scars of too many deployments. Another message, just subtle enough to be deniable. You're not here to fight. Just watch. Her radio chirped again, this time with a clipped cadence of an operations brief. The enemy convoy, armored carriers, troop transports, and at least one vehicle suspected of carrying stolen nuclear launch codes would be in the valley by late afternoon. The bridge was their only way across. Harrow's voice returned over the channel. Primary strike team is in final position. Expect them to engage at standard range. You just keep your eyes open. Sorrel turned a page in her journal. A photograph was tucked there, slightly bent from years of being carried into the field. Herself, a teenager in dress uniform, standing beside a tall man with steel gray hair and artillery insignia gleaming on his chest. Her father's expression was unreadable in the picture, but she remembered the day, remembered the weight of his hand on her shoulder when he'd said, "Artillery is poetry, Sorrel. It's not just machinery. It's how you read the air, the land, the moment." She traced the corner of the photograph with her thumb before tucking it away. She might be alone on this ridge, but she hadn't come empty-handed. She'd inherited more than his name. The hours crawled forward. She checked the weather meter again. The readings weren't good. A low-pressure system was bearing down faster than predicted, which meant the wind would shift unpredictably as it poured through the gorge. She logged the changes in careful script. It wasn't data a computer could understand, not the way she could. From far off, a flicker of light caught her attention. She lifted the binoculars, nothing but the valley road twisting into shadow. Still, her gut tightened. She had learned to trust that instinct. It had saved her before. The radio crackled with idle chatter from the other teams, full of a kind of swagger people used when they thought the outcome was inevitable. The kind that vanished when things went wrong. Sorrel flipped back through her notes, past the sketches of the valley and the atmospheric graphs, to the old equations her father had written in his own hand. Equations for pushing a shell far beyond what the manuals said was possible. Equations that had been laughed out of artillery reviews. Officially, her howitzer's maximum range was about 30 kilometers. She was nearly 9 kilometers beyond that. On paper, the shot was impossible. But she didn't live on paper. She set her pencil down and looked once more through the scope toward the bridge. The steel trusses gleamed faintly in the thin sunlight. If the convoy reached it, she'd have seconds, maybe less, to decide whether to obey her orders or trust her calculations. The wind changed again, sharper now, and she smiled faintly to herself. She could feel the air moving the way her father had taught her, like a river with hidden currents. And if command thought she'd just sit here and watch, they'd forgotten whose daughter they'd put on this ridge. By mid-morning, the mountains had shaken off their dawn colors and turned to hard stone under a high, white sun. Sorrel sat cross-legged beside her howitzer, journal open, the tip of her pencil scratching a steady rhythm against the page. Each column of numbers, each curved line of notation, was a fragment of a larger puzzle, one she'd been assembling since she'd arrived. The Karakoram Valley was a deceiver. From the ridge, it looked open and straightforward, but the air moved through it like a restless animal. Crosswinds borne miles away slipped down hidden passes, collided with updrafts from the gorge, and twisted into invisible whirlpools before dissipating. On a good day, a standard targeting computer could read maybe half of it. On a bad day, the computers just lied. Sorrel didn't need a computer. She had something better. Years of training under a man who taught her that wind wasn't random. It was a language. She just had to listen. She measured the breeze again with her handheld meter. The numbers didn't match the models command would be relying on. That meant the primary strike team, perched on a ridge with entirely different wind patterns, would be making calculations that wouldn't work here. The thought left a bitter taste. If they fired based on faulty assumptions, the convoy would cross unharmed. She switched to her father's old notes, the paper yellowed at the edges from years in the field. His handwriting was precise but heavy, the pencil lines pressed into the fibers, as though each equation had been carved there. She traced the formula for extended-range firing with her gloved finger, noting the small deviations from standard doctrine, tiny adjustments for air density, earth curvature, even the subtle tug of Coriolis force. Anyone can fire a shell, he'd told her once. Few can make it sing. The radio hissed in her ear. Tavelvana's report. Wind shift detected. Barometric pressure dropping faster than forecast. Recommend the primary team adjust for. Noted Major. Harrow cut in, his tone like a slammed door. Primary team sensors will handle it. Sensors that couldn't read the valley from 30 kilometers away. She ground her teeth but swallowed the retort. Every word she spoke would be one more mark in the column labeled attitude problem. The faint hum of her satellite phone startled her. She flipped it open and pressed it to her ear. Tavelvana's. Still in the middle of nowhere. The voice on the other end carried an amused lilt. Captain Alara Drost, intelligence officer, occasional ally, and one of the few who'd never treated her like a mascot. Just doing my duty, Sorrel replied cautiously. Even secure lines weren't always secure. Of course. A pause. Unofficially, you should know something. Intel thinks the convoy's ahead of schedule. Could be here in half the time. Sorrel stiffened. That's not what command's saying. They're getting scrambled signals. Weather's interfering with aerial surveillance. My sources put them moving faster, maybe riding a tailwind through the passes. She glanced toward the eastern approach. Nothing visible yet, but the road there twisted like a snake. The convoy could be much closer than it seemed. I appreciate it, she said quietly. Alara's voice softened. Whatever happens, your father would have been proud. The line went dead before Sorrel could answer. She returned the phone to her pocket and leaned over the scope again, glassing the road. Empty. For now. The clock in her head began to tick louder. Her ammunition count was pitiful, 2 shells. Technically, for signaling. Realistically, they were all she had if things went wrong. 1 shot to gauge conditions. 1 shot to make history. Her father's notes came back to mind. He'd always said the M777 could reach beyond its rated 30 kilometers. But he'd only managed 35 in testing before politics shut him down. Her bridge was 38.7. The difference between impossible and possible would come down to the kind of precision most officers didn't even try for. She began recalculating. The pencil moved in swift arcs over the paper, adjusting for the latest pressure drop, factoring in the changing density of the cold mountain air. She worked the math twice, then a third time, looking for even a whisper of doubt. Every variable had to be nailed down. The shell's climb, its slow turn at apogee, the long fall into the valley, the angle of impact against the bridge's weakest point. Another gust rolled across the ridge, snapping the edges of the camouflage net. She looked up, feeling the wind against her cheek, imagining its path across the mountains. She could see it in her mind, the way it would lift the shell in the first seconds, then buffet it sideways halfway through, then fade just before impact. She wrote, solution viable. 0 margin for error. The sun climbed higher, and a thin layer of snow began to soften on the rocks. Heat shimmer distorted the valley floor, an enemy to any gunner trying to pick a precise aim point. She adjusted the scope a few millimeters, chasing the perfect alignment. The voice in her earpiece broke the silence. All units be advised. Convoy ETA to bridge, 6 hours. Maintain readiness. 6 hours was a lie. If Alara's sources were right, she might have less than 3. She closed the journal for a moment, letting her eyes rest. The mountains were so still it almost hurt to look at them. Somewhere out there, a column of steel and men was threading its way toward the only crossing for miles. Somewhere, a group of officers in a warm command room believed they controlled the timetable. She smiled faintly to herself. Timetables didn't matter much to the wind. Or to her. By early afternoon, the light went hard and white, flattening everything until rock, snow, and sky were just different shades of glare. Sorrel's breath had lost its fog. The wind had turned dry and thin, carrying the faint scent of iron from the gorge. She ran the numbers again, pressure trending down, wind vector swinging 5 degrees, then settling. The radio flared to life with a burst of overlapping voices, the sound of a room filling with people who suddenly cared about clocks. Be advised, drone feed has eyes on dust plumes east of the valley, possible convoy elements. Confirm. Negative visual IDs. Weather interference. Then the line went quiet. That kind of quiet that meant someone important had walked in and everyone else was waiting to see which way authority would kick. Sorrel steadied the binoculars and scanned the eastern approach. The road there rose and fell in long, deceptive swells, vanishing behind shoulders of rock before emerging closer than expected. Heat shimmer played tricks, but she had learned to read through the mirage. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker, sunlight flashing off a panel at a distance that didn't belong to the landscape. She tracked the glint until it joined another, and another, like beads strung on an invisible line. Convoy visual, she murmured, not yet keying the mic, letting the words exist just for her. Her pencil moved on instinct, marking time, speed, spacing. She'd seen enough columns to know when discipline ran tight. Whoever led this one had drilled them well, equal intervals, no bunching, recon vehicles skimming the flanks. The operations net crackled open again with force comm. All units, update. Convoy approaching eastern entrance. ETA to bridge, 15 minutes. 15. Alara had been right. Command had been wrong. Another voice, cool, clipped, threaded with annoyance. Primary strike team, report readiness. A beat. Static. Then, primary team encountering terrain issues. ETA to firing position, 28 minutes. 28 might as well have been tomorrow. The bridge would be crossed and the column dispersed on the far side by then. In the command center, she could almost see it. Someone slammed a palm on a console. Someone else refused to look up. She remembered the fluorescent light of those rooms, the undertone of coffee and fear. Sorrel drew a line in her journal between now and 15 minutes from now, then divided it into the few moments that actually mattered. The last recon vehicle would clear the span. The lead heavy would enter. The column would commit. You could stop a column at the head or the tail, but if you wanted to pin the entire snake in place, you cut the bridge under it. She keyed the mic, observer Tavelvanas. Confirmed visual on convoy. Lead element will enter bridge in approximately 2 minutes. Markings indicate high-value transport in the first third. Colonel Harrow came on, voice tight. Copy, observer. Maintain position. Do not engage. Primary team will. Sir, she said, as politely as she could shape the word. Primary team cannot engage in time. A pause. She imagined his jaw working. We have contingencies you are not privy to. Sorrel swallowed a laugh that wouldn't have sounded kind. She studied the bridge through the scope, counted bolts on the truss, traced the diagonal members with her eye until the structure lived in her bones. Every bridge had a secret, a point where stress gathered like stormwater in a culvert. Find that point, and a small hammer could do the work of a landslide. Her father had shown her years ago, by tapping a ruler balanced across 2 textbooks until the whole arrangement snapped. Don't hit the strongest part, kid. Hit the place holding all the arguments together. She nudged the elevation wheel a quarter turn, then another. The reticle settled exactly where the bridge's central support met the underside of the deck. If she were a shell, and right now she was mentally utterly, she would arc high, breathe thin air, drift on a crosswind she'd already measured, and come down on that joint like a letter delivered to a specific hand. The first vehicles reached the bridge. The lead armor rolled on, cautious but committed. Behind it, the convoy compressed slightly, drivers doing the math and deciding now was not the time to hesitate. Sorrel keyed the mic again. Command, I have a structural collapse solution for the bridge. Request permission to fire. She had prepared herself for denial. She had not prepared for laughter. It came over the channel like poor encryption. Ragged, unprofessional. A release valve hissing open. Major Kieran's voice cut through it, laced with contempt he probably thought had no scent. Tavelvanas, your battery is nearly 9 kilometers beyond max effective. You'll waste ammunition and give away our position. Negative on the fire request. Then Harrow clipped to the point of breaking. Lieutenant, he never used her current rank when irritated. He always reached for the one that diminished. Stand down. Observe and report. That is an order. The lead transport's markings came into crisp relief. The paint scuffed along the edges of a sealed panel no recon unit would wear. She didn't need to see inside to know what sat under that steel. She checked the wind again, then glanced at the clock face she'd penciled onto the corner of her page. Her window was narrowing to the width of a breath. Her father's voice arrived unbidden, so clear she almost turned to find him. Trust what you know, not what they tell you is possible. Her heart wasn't hammering. It had gone steady and quiet, a metronome in a room with no other sound. She slid the second shell, the one she'd promised herself she would not need, back into the crate and palmed the first into the breech. The metal swallowed it with the clean, oiled certainty of a machine built for a single purpose. She pressed the mic with respect command. Target window is closing in 50 seconds. I cannot comply. There was shouting then. She heard her name the way you hear a word underwater, big and slow. She cut the channel before the next order arrived. It wouldn't be the kind she could obey. She leaned into the scope one last time. The world narrowed to lines and numbers. She felt the wind lift a whisper, then soften. She adjusted half a click. Breath in. Hold. The horizon paused. She fired. The howitzer kicked like a living thing. The recoil tore through her shoulder and into the rock, a satisfying, physical confirmation that a decision had been made and could not be taken back. The shell vaulted into the sky, dwindling to a dark fleck against the blue. For an instant the mountains held their pose, as if waiting to see whether they'd be asked to witness history or mistake. She opened the channel again, not to argue, simply to narrate. Shot away. Tracking. In the command center, they would have already pulled up a predictive arc, watched it snap and extend across their screens. Some would scoff, some would calculate legal language. Some would glance at the exit door as if distance could save them from embarrassment. Sorrel watched through the scope and did math the way some people pray. At 20,000 feet, the crosswind would shear. She had budgeted for it. The shell would lose velocity, its aerodynamics shifting from bullet to thrown stone. She had budgeted for that too. Curvature of the earth, almost negligible at this range, but not quite. Coriolis, it mattered more than most admitted if you cared about single meters, and she did. The dot fell. For a few seconds, it was a matter of faith, a faith not in miracles, but in the stubborn honesty of physics. Then the speck resolved into shape and speed and angle, and she knew. Impact came like a punctuation mark you feel in your teeth. Not the dramatic blossom of a direct vehicle strike, not the spectacle that audiences hunger after. It was cleaner, meaner. The shell knifed into the junction beneath the bridge deck, the one she had caressed with the reticle 100 times in her head. For a breath, nothing happened. The convoy continued forward. Drivers glanced at one another. Command prepared the reprimand. Hairline fractures flowered in the concrete with the delicacy of ice forming on a lake. They found each other quickly, shivering together into larger breaks along the load paths she had mapped. Steel protested. First a groan, then a scream. The central support shifted. Mass remembered gravity. The deck folded with terrible politeness, like a gentleman bowing at the waist. On Sorrel's ridge, the gust that followed smelled like wet dust and old iron. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She just exhaled the breath she'd been saving and wrote the result in her journal with a hand so steady it surprised her. Target neutralized, she said into the mic, her voice as even as if she were logging a weather shift. Bridge collapsed. Lead vehicles eliminated. Remaining convoy immobilized on far side. Silence claimed the net. Not the busy silence of many voices holding back, but the wide, stunned kind that opens over a canyon when an echo never returns. When sound finally came, it was someone whispering the word impossible, as if that would change the visible truth on the screens. Then chairs scraped and orders tumbled out, and the room remembered it had a job beyond disbelief. Sorrel ejected the spent casing and set it beside the crate, then began packing her tools. No flourish, no haste. She had the sense of a door closing behind her and another opening in a corridor she hadn't been permitted to walk before. The earpiece clicked once, then carried a new voice, older, rougher, steadied by years of decisions that didn't fit into tidy reports. Major Tavelvanas, this is General Van Tiss. She straightened without thinking. General. Report confirmed. You will return to base and brief me personally. Effective immediately. Copy. She paused. The mountain wind tugged at the corner of her journal, flipping it open to a page of her father's dense pencil marks. General, she added, unable to keep the human thread out of her voice, my calculations are recorded. I'll bring the data. A beat. Do. The channel clicked dead. Down in the valley, the ruined bridge threw smoke like exhausted breath. On the far side, the rest of the convoy idled in a stranded semicircle. Engines ticking, crews staring at a geometry problem that had no answer today. On her ridge, Sorrel closed the journal over her father's script and secured it in her pack. She checked the gun one last time, laying a hand on cool metal that had done all anyone could ask of it. Around her, the mountains pretended indifference. The wind, untroubled by doctrine, went on moving exactly as it pleased. She started down the path toward the long walkout, the weight of the pack honest on her shoulders. Behind her, the echo of the shot lingered, not as thunder or spectacle, but as a quiet, unarguable fact. the moment the window closed, and she chose to climb through it anyway. The base was quieter than Sorrel expected when she finally stepped through its gates. No gawkers, no clapping hands, no whispered speculation trailing her boots. Just the sound of rain ticking off corrugated roofing and the diesel growl of a truck somewhere in the motor pool. The storm she'd watched brewing over the mountains had caught up with her on the march back, soaking her jacket and muting the sharp edges of the day. Inside, the air smelled of coffee gone bitter and wet wool. The duty sergeant barely looked up from his logbook when she signed in, though she saw his eyes flicker to the weapon case slung over her shoulder. He didn't ask. Maybe he already knew. Maybe everyone already knew. "Major Tavelvanas," the sergeant said. "General Vantis is expecting you." The general's office was in the upper block of the main administration building, a space as far removed from the wind-swept ridges as could exist in the same war. Sorrel paused outside the door, straightened her damp uniform, and stepped in at his call. General Orlon Vantis stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He was tall, but carried his height in a way that didn't need reminding. His hair was steel, his eyes the color of incoming weather. He didn't turn when she saluted. "Major," he said, still watching the rain streak the glass, "you disobeyed a direct order today." "Yes, sir." "You risked revealing your position to enemy reconnaissance." "Yes, sir." "You fired a shot 9 kilometers beyond the rated maximum range of your assigned weapon." "Yes, sir." He turned then, his expression unreadable. "And you destroyed the target, neutralized all high-value assets, and prevented a catastrophic breach of our security. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." The corner of his mouth twitched, something that might have been approval, if it weren't so carefully restrained. "Sit." She took the chair opposite his desk. He opened a folder on the blotter, sliding a single sheet toward her. It was a still frame from a drone feed. The bridge mid-collapse, her shell's impact point circled in red. Even frozen, the image hummed with finality. "Our ballistics team has been evaluating your shot," he said, each word weighed. "They've been at it for hours. So far, the consensus is that it shouldn't have been possible." "Sir," Sorrel said evenly, "the consensus is wrong." Vantis studied her for a long moment, then gestured. "Show me." She set her field journal on the desk, opening to the page where fresh notations crowded beside her father's faded handwriting. Standard military firing tables assume maximum effective range at 30 kilometers because beyond that, too many unmodeled factors destabilize accuracy. Air density variation, curvature of the Earth, Coriolis effect depending on latitude, and wind shear at high altitude. Vantis finished for her. "Yes, sir. Most fire control computers can't model it well in mountainous terrain. My father developed an algorithm for extreme range firing." She caught the flicker in his eyes. "You knew him." "We served together," Vantis said quietly. "He was brilliant, and an unrepentant thorn in the side of anyone who thought the manual was the final word." He tapped the page. "These are his equations. I've refined them," she said. "Field tested. Adjusted for shell aerodynamics, as velocity drops below supersonic." He sat back, the leather of his chair creaking. "And today was the first operational proof." "Yes, sir. We may never get another opportunity to test under these exact conditions." For a moment, he said nothing, only looked at the journal as if it were an artifact. Then, "Colonel Harrow has already filed a request for court-martial proceedings." "I expected that." "I denied it." Her shoulders eased a fraction. "It's difficult to court-martial an officer whose disobedience saved the mission," Vantis said. "In 3 weeks, you'll attend a ceremony to receive the Distinguished Artillery Service Medal. In the meantime, I'm assigning you to the Artillery Doctrine Review Committee. You'll lead a project to rewrite our long-range targeting protocols." Sorrel blinked. "Sir, that's exactly what needs to happen," he interrupted. "Your father tried to change the system with theory. You've done it with results. That makes it harder for the old guard to ignore." She nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. "Understood, sir." Vantis closed the journal carefully, sliding it back across the desk. "One more thing. When you give your debrief to the committee, leave nothing out. I want them to see every variable, every scrap of calculation. If they're going to rewrite the manual, they need to know exactly why they were wrong." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, silvering the parade ground. Sorrel walked back toward her quarters, the case with her weapon balanced against her shoulder, the journal under her arm. She thought of the ridge, the wind, the impossible arc of steel, and the moment the bridge gave way. In her room, she set the journal on her desk and opened it to the photograph tucked inside. Her father looked out from a younger time, his gaze steady, mouth set in that half-smile he wore when he knew a lesson had landed. "You were right," she told him quietly, "about everything." The rain tapped at the window in a steady, approving rhythm. 3 weeks later, the parade ground shimmered under a late morning sun. Dress uniforms lined the viewing stands, rows of pressed fabric and gleaming brass, but the air was taut with curiosity. Most in attendance had read the after-action report. Some had studied the drone footage frame by frame. A few still muttered luck under their breath. Sorrel stood in the front rank, her boots aligned perfectly with the chalk line painted across the concrete. Her field journal was back in her quarters, but she could feel its weight all the same, a quiet reminder of the math, the wind, and the ridge that had brought her here. General Van Tis stepped to the podium, his shadow falling long in the morning light. "Today," he began, "we recognize an action that should not have been possible, an action that, by every manual and firing table, was doomed to fail." His gaze swept the crowd, pinning the doubters in place. But manuals can be wrong, and sometimes it takes one officer's refusal to accept those limits to prove it. He called her name. Sorrel stepped forward, saluted, and bowed her head slightly as he pinned the Distinguished Artillery Service medal to her chest. The medal was cool against her uniform, heavy not with his weight, but with the fact that it represented a change no one could take back. When the ceremony ended, officers clustered in knots, some to offer stiff congratulations, others to probe for details of her calculations. Colonel Harrow approached last, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Your father would be proud," he said finally. "I should have recognized your ability sooner." Sorrel kept her voice level. "Recognition isn't why I took the shot, sir." He nodded once, as if that answer cut deeper than anything else she could have said. The next month moved quickly. Van Tis made good on his assignment to the Artillery Doctrine Review Committee. For the first time in her career, Sorrel wasn't just in the room. She was at the head of the table. Her journal's equations became the scaffolding for a new section of the manual, one that addressed extreme-range targeting with variables the old doctrine had ignored. At first, the pushback was loud. Veteran gunners insisted no one could calculate in the field under such conditions. Sorrel countered with her ridge data, wind charts, pressure logs, the firing solution that had brought down the bridge. Eventually, the numbers quieted the room. By the end of the quarter, the Tavelvanas method was officially adopted for advanced artillery training. Her father's equations, once dismissed as outliers, were printed in regulation ink. 6 months later, she returned to Fort Sill, not as a trainee, but as a lecturer. The same range where instructors once whispered about her behind clipboards now displayed a tactical map of her impossible shot. She faced a classroom of officers, younger and older, all wearing the skeptical look of people deciding whether to believe. "The fundamentals of ballistics haven't changed," she told them. "What's changed is how we understand those fundamentals under extreme conditions." One instructor raised a hand. "With respect, Major, most officers can't run these numbers under fire." "That's why we're building targeting systems that can," Sorrel replied. "But understanding the physics means that when the system fails or the weather lies, you can still adapt. Doctrine is only as good as the person applying it." After class, Major Kieran caught her in the corridor. "You've turned artillery training on its head. Some of the old guard still hate it." "Let them," she said, gathering her materials. "Results speak louder." Kieran grinned. "Speaking of results, Van Tis is forming a new long-range unit. Specialized kit, unconventional tactics. He wants you to command it." She blinked. "Me? You'll have the rank for it by the time we stand up." Apparently, Breaking the rules gets rewarded when you're right. A year after the Ridge, Major Sorrel Tavelvanes stood before her unit on a windswept training ground. The lineup was diverse, officers chosen for insight, adaptability, and a stubborn streak that made them dangerous in the right way. They were drilling firing solutions most of the Army still considered theory. In the classroom, behind her, a map of her bridge shot hung like a banner. It wasn't there as a trophy. It was there as a challenge. Don't tell me it can't be done. Through the window, she watched a young recruit, nervous but sharp, run through a complex trajectory problem. The solution was clean. Instead of praise, Sorrel gave a single, respectful nod. It was all she'd ever wanted from her own instructors. That evening, as the sun bled down behind the range, she stood on a low ridge while her team prepared for a night shoot. Her father's photograph was still tucked into her journal, now joined by her medal citation and a printed copy of the revised manual. Major. A junior officer approached, weather log in hand. That shot you made, the one that changed everything. How did it feel? Sorrel let her gaze rest on the horizon. It felt like truth, like proving the world runs on laws we can learn if we're willing to look past the limits people give us. She glanced at the artillery pieces below. Now we get to push those limits together. The first muzzle flash split the dark, followed by another. Shells arced into the night on paths that would have been unthinkable a year ago, paths she had already charted in her mind. And in that steady thunder, she heard the same quiet certainty she'd felt on the ridge, the knowledge that the impossible was only a problem waiting for the right solution.